I have been falling for 11 years. Not literally, you understand. My body remains stationary, trapped in the same hab-block where I was born, where I grew up, where I watched my mother die and my father disappear and my siblings scatter to fates I will never know. But the world around me has been falling since I was 19 years old, dropping away level by level, and I have learned that there are many kinds of descent that have nothing to do with gravity. My name is Sarah Voth. I was a sanitation clerk in Hive Primus, subsector Cavell 7, level 4412. That designation meant nothing to anyone who did not live there, and now it means nothing at all, because level 4412 no longer exists, neither do the 3000 levels above it, or the 800 below. Hive Primus is dying, has been dying since before I was born, and I have had the peculiar privilege of watching its death from the inside. They tell me I am one of the last survivors of the upper collapse zones. They tell me my testimony is valuable, that the administratum requires documentation of structural failures for future hive construction projects, that my experiences will help prevent similar catastrophes in cities not yet built. They tell me many things. The officials who visit my refugee compartment in what remains of the midhive, and I nod and agree and give them the answers they want, because I have learned that cooperation is the only currency that matters when you have lost everything else. But the reports they file are not the truth. They cannot be. The truth of what happens when a hive city collapses floor by floor cannot be captured in bureaucratic language, cannot be reduced to structural analysis and casualty estimates and resource allocation tables. The truth is something that lives in the body, in the memories that surface unbidden in moments of quiet, in the sounds I still hear when I close my eyes. The truth is that I watched 12 million people die, and I survived, and I do not know which of those facts is harder to live with. It started with the water. Hive Primus drew its water from deep aquifers, pumped up through a network of pipes and filtration systems that had been functioning since before the Emperor's light reached our world. The system was ancient, yes, corroded in places, jury-rigged in others, maintained by tech adepts who had long since forgotten the original specifications and simply replaced components as they failed. But it worked. For 8,000 years, it worked, until it didn't. I was 23 when the first pipe burst on level 4,890, nearly 500 levels above my home. The initial reports were routine, a maintenance issue, nothing more. The adepts were already responding. But the pipe that burst had been carrying wastewater from the industrial sectors above, and the burst sent that wastewater flooding into the structural supports of the level's western quadrant. The supports, already weakened by millennia of vibration and settlement and inadequate maintenance, began to fail. Level 4,890 fell on level 4,889 at 14:32 local time on the 17th day of the month of Ascension. I remember the exact moment because I was filing sanitation reports when the tremor reached us, a shudder that ran through the walls and floor like a living thing. We felt it on level 4,412, nearly 500 floors below. We felt it, and we looked at each other with the first flickers of fear. And then we went back to work, because what else could we do? The news filtered down through the day. A structural failure. Casualties in the thousands, emergency services responding. The administratum was assessing the damage. Citizens were advised to remain calm and continue their duties. We remained calm. We continued our duties. We were good citizens of the Imperium, trained from birth to trust in the systems that governed our lives, and we did not yet understand that those systems had already failed us in ways we could not begin to imagine. The second collapse came 3 days later. Level 4,889, already damaged by the impact from above, gave way under stresses its designers had never anticipated. It fell on level 4,888, which fell on level 4,887, and for 17 minutes, the upper hive experienced a cascade failure that consumed 43 levels before the emergency bulkheads finally held. 43 levels. approximately 200,000 people, gone in 17 minutes. I heard it. We all heard it, everyone in the midhive. A sound like thunder that went on and on and on, accompanied by a shaking that knocked objects from shelves and cracked walls and sent children screaming into their parents' arms. The power failed for 6 hours. The air recyclers stopped. By the time the emergency systems kicked in, 300 people on my level alone had suffocated in compartments whose ventilation had been compromised. The administratum declared a state of emergency. Resources were allocated. Rescue teams were dispatched. Structural assessors were sent to evaluate the damage and determine whether the remaining levels were stable. They were not stable. They were never stable. The hive had been dying for centuries, its infrastructure crumbling under the weight of population growth and inadequate maintenance, and the simple, unavoidable entropy that claims all human works eventually. The cascade failure had not caused the instability, it had merely revealed it, torn away the comfortable illusions we had all been living under and exposed the rot beneath. But the administratum did not tell us that. They told us the situation was contained. They told us the damaged sections had been isolated. They told us to return to our duties and trust in the Emperor's protection. I returned to my duties. I filed sanitation reports. I processed waste allocation requests and water recycling quotas and all the tedious minutiae of keeping a Hive City's sanitation systems functional. And at night, I lay awake in my hab unit and listened to the groaning of the walls, the subtle shifts and settlings that I had never noticed before, and I wondered how long we had left. 3 months. That was the answer, though I did not know it then. 3 months before the next major failure, before the emergency bulkheads that had saved us gave way under stresses they were never designed to handle, before the cascade resumed and began eating its way down toward us. The evacuation orders came too late. They always come too late. In a Hive City, there are too many people, too few routes, too much infrastructure that was designed for normal operation and cannot handle the demands of mass exodus. When level 4,800 began to collapse, there were still 3 million people in the levels directly below it, and the evacuation corridors could handle perhaps 10,000 per hour. Do the mathematics. I did, in those first desperate days. I calculated how long it would take to evacuate everyone, how many would be saved, how many would be left behind. The numbers were not kind. The numbers were never kind. My mother was among the first to go. Not in the collapse itself, we were still 200 levels below the immediate danger zone, but in the panic that followed. The crowds in the evacuation corridors became crushing, became stampedes, became killing floors, where the weak and the slow were trampled by those desperate to escape. My mother was 63 years old. She had a bad hip from a factory accident in her youth. She could not move fast enough. I found her body 3 days later, pressed against a bulkhead with 17 others who had been caught in the same crush. Her face was peaceful. I tell myself her face was peaceful. I tell myself she did not suffer, that it was quick, that she did not spend her final moments in terror and agony. I tell myself many things. My father disappeared during the same evacuation. We were separated in the crowds. One moment he was beside me, his hand gripping my arm, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the mass of bodies, and I never saw him again. I searched for weeks, checking refugee lists and morgue records, and the endless bureaucratic databases that tracked the living and the dead. His name never appeared. He simply vanished. One more casualty in a disaster too large for individual accounting. My brothers and sisters scattered. Kale made it to the lower hive and found work in the manufactorums. Liz was conscripted into an emergency labor gang and died 3 months later when the tunnel she was reinforcing collapsed. The twins Mira and Thomas were evacuated to a different sector, and I lost contact with them entirely. I do not know if they are alive or dead. I do not know if I want to know. I stayed. I do not entirely understand why, even now, the evacuation routes were still open, at least partially. I could have fled downward, could have joined the millions streaming toward the lower hive and the relative safety of levels built on bedrock rather than the accumulated weight of 8,000 years of construction. But something held me in place, stubbornness, perhaps, or denial, or simply the paralysis that comes when catastrophe exceeds the mind's capacity to process it. I returned to my hab unit. I returned to my duties. The sanitation department was still functioning. Someone had to process the waste from the refugee camps, had to manage the water allocation for the surviving levels, had to keep the systems running even as the world collapsed around us. I filed reports. I attended meetings. I pretended that normalcy was still possible, that routine could protect me from the chaos. For a while, it almost worked. The collapse continued in fits and starts over the following years. Some months were quiet, the structural failures slowed, the evacuation corridors cleared, and we dared to hope that the worst had passed. Other months were nightmares, cascade failures that consumed dozens of levels in hours, refugee waves that overwhelmed our already strained resources, death tolls that climbed into the hundreds of thousands before anyone could begin to count accurately. I learned to read the signs. The groaning of overstressed metal, the hairline cracks that appeared in walls and ceilings before major failures, the subtle changes in air pressure that indicated compromised seals somewhere above. I learned to sleep with a bag packed, to keep my emergency rations topped up, to always know the fastest route to the nearest reinforced shelter. I learned to stop mourning. There was no time for grief, no space for it. Everyone I knew lost someone. Everyone I knew was losing someone, constantly, an endless attrition that made death as routine as breathing. We stopped holding memorial services. We stopped speaking the names of the dead. We simply absorbed each loss and kept moving, kept working, kept surviving. The hive adapted, in its way. The administratum established new governance structures for the shrinking population. The Mechanicus sent adepts to reinforce critical infrastructure. The ecclesiarchy held mass prayers for the dead and the dying, their sermons broadcast through every functioning vox speaker, promising salvation in the emperor's light for those who maintained their faith. I attended the services when I could, not because I believed my faith had died somewhere in the rubble of level 4,600, crushed, along with the 17,000 people who had trusted in the emergency shelters that were supposed to protect them, but because the services provided structure, routine, something to anchor the mind when everything else was chaos. Father Mordecai led most of the services in my sector. He was a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much, and his sermons had a desperate quality that I found oddly comforting. He did not pretend that everything would be fine. He did not offer false hope or empty promises. He simply acknowledged the horror, named it, held it up to the light of the emperor's gaze, and told us that our suffering had meaning even if we could not perceive it. I wanted to believe him. Throne help me, I wanted to believe that the deaths of millions served some purpose in the emperor's grand design, that my mother's trampled body and my father's disappearance and Lys's burial under tons of ferrocrete were part of a plan too vast for mortal comprehension. I wanted to believe because the alternative that it was all random, meaningless, a simple consequence of entropy and neglect and the accumulated failures of 8,000 years was too terrible to contemplate. But belief does not come on command. Faith cannot be summoned through will alone, and as the years passed, and the levels continued to fall, and the death toll climbed past 8 million, past 10 million, past 12 million, I found that whatever capacity for faith I had once possessed had been crushed out of me, compressed into something hard and small and cold that sat in my chest where my heart used to be. I stopped attending the services. I stopped pretending. I simply worked and waited and watched the numbers on the structural integrity reports climb toward critical. Level 4,412 fell when I was 27 years old. I was not in my hab unit when it happened. Small mercies. I was 3 levels down, in a supply depot, filing requisition forms for water recycling equipment. The tremor was the worst I had ever felt, not just a shaking but a dropping sensation, a stomach-lurching instant of freefall before the level beneath caught the falling debris and groaned under the impact. I knew, in that moment, that everything I owned was gone. Every memento of my family, every photograph, every small possession I had accumulated over 27 years of life. The clothes I was wearing and the data slate in my hand were all I had left. I did not cry. I had forgotten how. The depot held. The level held. I spent 3 days trapped in the supply room with 11 other survivors, rationing water and recycled air, listening to the rescue teams cutting through the debris above us. When they finally broke through, they told us we were lucky. They told us the structural damage was extensive, but contained. They told us we would be relocated to a refugee camp in the midhive, where resources were more plentiful and the infrastructure was more stable. They were lying, of course. They had to lie. If they had told us the truth, that the midhive was just as compromised, that the collapse was accelerating, that the administratum's projections gave us perhaps 5 more years before the entire upper structure came down, we might have panicked. We might have rioted. We might have done something other than shuffle obediently to our assigned compartments and resume our assigned duties and continue pretending that survival was possible. I spent 4 years in refugee camp 7 Kappa, 4 years of processed protein and recycled water and sleeping in a compartment designed for 2 that held 8. 4 years of watching the reports, tracking the failures, calculating the shrinking buffer between the collapse zone and our location. 4 years of working in the sanitation department. They always needed sanitation workers, no matter how bad things got, and filing reports that no one would ever read about systems that would soon cease to exist. The camp had its own society, its own hierarchies, its own small cruelties and unexpected kindnesses. I learned who could be trusted and who could not, who would share their rations when times were hard and who would steal from the dying. I learned to sleep lightly, to guard my few possessions, to move through crowds with my elbows out and my eyes alert. I learned to stop thinking about the future. The future was a collapsing ceiling, a falling floor, a cascade failure waiting to happen. The present was all that mattered. This meal, this shift, this night's sleep in a too-crowded compartment that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. I was 31 when Camp 7 Kappa was evacuated. The structural assessors had finally admitted what everyone already knew. The midhive was compromised, the support columns were failing, and we had perhaps 6 months before the entire section came down. The evacuation was more orderly this time. 11 years of practice had taught the administratum something about managing mass relocations, but it was still chaos, still crushing crowds and inadequate corridors, and not enough transport for everyone who needed it. I made it to the lower hive. Barely. The transport I was on broke down in a junction tunnel, and we had to walk the last 15 kilometers through maintenance passages that had not been used in centuries. 12 of us started that walk. 9 of us finished it. The lower hive was different. Built on bedrock, anchored to the planet's crust, it had a solidity that the upper levels had never possessed. The air was thicker, heavier with the smell of industry and the heat of geothermal vents. The light was dimmer, filtered through layers of grime and distance from the hive's upper spires. But the walls did not groan. The floor did not shake. For the first time in 11 years, I slept without one ear listening for the sounds of structural failure. I thought I was safe. I thought the collapse had finally run out of levels to consume, that the reinforced foundations of the lower hive would hold against whatever stresses the dying upper structure imposed. I thought I could finally stop running, stop calculating, stop waiting for the next disaster. I was wrong. The thing about cascading structural failures is that they do not simply stop. Each collapsed level adds weight to the levels below, stress that compounds and accumulates and eventually exceeds the design tolerances of even the most robust construction. The lower hive was built to support itself. It was not built to support the weight of 8,000 years of collapsed infrastructure pressing down from above. The cracks appeared 6 months after I arrived. Hairline at first, barely visible. the kind of thing you might dismiss as normal settling in any other context. But I had learned to read the signs. I had spent 11 years watching a hive die. I knew what those cracks meant. I filed a report. The sanitation department had given me a new position, waste processing in Sector 9. Nothing glamorous but steady work, and I used my access to the interdepartmental communication systems to flag my concerns to the Structural Assessment Office. I included my observations, my calculations, my predictions based on 11 years of watching the same patterns play out again and again. They ignored me. Of course they ignored me. I was a sanitation clerk, not an engineer. What did I know about structural integrity, about load-bearing calculations, about the complex mathematics of hive architecture? I knew only what I had seen, what I had survived, and that was not the kind of knowledge that appeared in credential databases or certification records. So I waited. I watched. I tracked the cracks as they spread, mapped them on a data slate I kept hidden in my sleeping compartment, calculated the stress distributions and failure probabilities with formulas I had taught myself from salvaged engineering texts. I knew I was right. I knew the collapse was coming. I just did not know when. 3 years. That was how long we had. 3 years of relative stability, of the lower hive functioning more or less as intended, of refugees from the upper collapse slowly integrating into the existing population or dying off from the accumulated trauma of their experiences. 3 years in which I almost began to believe that I had been wrong, that the cracks were just cracks, that the lower hive would hold. And then, 14 months ago, level 2,200 fell. It was not the catastrophic cascade failure I had expected. The lower hive's construction was too robust for that, the support structures too redundant, the emergency systems too well maintained. But level 2,200 fell nonetheless, pancaking onto level 2,199 with a force that killed 40,000 people in seconds and sent shockwaves through the entire lower structure. The cracks I had been tracking split wide open. Emergency bulkheads that should have sealed automatically failed to activate. Water mains burst, flooding 3 sectors with contaminated runoff. Power systems fluctuated, plunging entire districts into darkness that lasted for days. And in the chaos, in the screaming and the dying and the desperate scramble for survival, I felt something I had not felt in years. Relief. It was wrong. I know it was wrong. 40,000 people died, and I felt relieved because it proved I had been right, because it validated 11 years of watching and waiting and being dismissed as a traumatized refugee who did not understand how the real world worked. I felt relieved, and then I felt sick, and then I felt nothing at all because the collapse was accelerating, and there was no time for emotion, only action. I joined the emergency response teams. My years of sanitation work had given me knowledge of the lower hive's infrastructure that few others possessed: the maintenance tunnels, the backup systems, the hidden passages that connected critical facilities. I guided rescue workers to survivors. I helped reroute water and power around damaged sections. I did what I could, which was not enough, which could never be enough, but was something. They noticed me. Eventually. The officials who managed the emergency response, the administratum functionaries who were trying to impose order on chaos, they saw that I knew things, understood things, could predict where the next failures would occur with an accuracy that bordered on prescient. They pulled me out of the rescue teams and put me in a planning room, surrounded by structural engineers and logistics specialists and people with credentials and titles that I would never possess. I told them what I knew. I showed them my maps, my calculations, my 11 years of accumulated observations. I told them that the collapse was not over, that the weight of the fallen upper hive was still pressing down, that the lower hive's foundations were strong but not infinitely strong. I told them that we had perhaps 5 years before the next major failure, less if the stress distribution shifted in certain ways. They listened. For the first time in 11 years, someone actually listened. But listening is not the same as acting. The administratum is vast, slow, bound by procedures and protocols, that were designed for stable systems and do not adapt well to crisis. My warnings were noted, filed, forwarded through appropriate channels, assessments were ordered, committees were formed, reports were generated, reviewed, revised, and generated again. Meanwhile, the cracks continued to spread. I am writing this account from a temporary shelter in Sector 12, one of the few areas of the lower hive that my calculations suggest will remain stable for the next several years. The administratum has finally begun evacuating the most compromised sections, relocating populations to areas with better structural integrity, reinforcing critical infrastructure where reinforcement is possible. They are doing what they can, which is not enough, which will never be enough. The hive is still falling. Slowly now, level by level rather than cascade by cascade, but falling nonetheless. Each week brings new reports of structural failures, new casualty figures, new refugee waves streaming towards sections that may or may not be able to hold them. The death toll continues to climb 14 million now, by the most recent estimates, though the true number is probably higher. 14 million people, more than the population of some Imperial worlds, gone, consumed by a collapse that started with a single burst pipe and a support structure that had been failing for centuries without anyone noticing. I have been asked many times why I stayed, why I did not flee to another hive, another world, another life far from the grinding death of Hive Primus. The administratum would have approved the transfer. They approve most transfer requests these days, eager to reduce the population burden on a structure they know cannot support it. I do not have a good answer. I tell them that someone has to document what happens, has to bear witness to the death of a city that housed 30 million souls at its peak. I tell them that my knowledge of the hive's infrastructure makes me valuable, that I can help save lives that would otherwise be lost. I tell them that I have nowhere else to go, that everyone I loved is dead or missing, that Hive Primus is the only home I have ever known. These things are true, but they are not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I am tired. 11 years of running, of calculating, of watching the world collapse around me. It has worn something down inside me, eroded whatever capacity I once had for hope or planning or imagining a future beyond the next disaster. I stay because leaving would require energy I no longer possess, would require believing that somewhere else might be better, would require faith in something beyond the immediate moment. I have no faith left. The collapse took it from me, along with my family and my home and my ability to sleep through the night without waking to phantom tremors. All I have left is the work, the monitoring, the mapping, the endless calculation of failure, probabilities, and evacuation routes, and structural stress distributions. The work gives me purpose. The work keeps me moving. The work is all I have. And perhaps, in the end, that is enough. Perhaps bearing witness is its own form of service, its own contribution to the Imperium's endless struggle against entropy and decay. Perhaps the reports I file, the warnings I issue, the knowledge I have accumulated through 11 years of survival, will help someone, somewhere, prevent another hive from dying the way Hive Primus is dying. Or perhaps not. Perhaps my testimony will be filed away in some administratum archive and never read. Another data point in a galaxy full of data points, another voice crying out from the wreckage of a civilization that does not know how to listen. I do not know. I cannot know. All I can do is continue watching, continue calculating, continue documenting the slow death of the only world I have ever known. What happens when a hive city collapses floor by floor? Everything falls. The walls, the floors, the ceilings, the infrastructure, the systems, the careful hierarchies that once seemed so permanent. The people, millions of them, crushed and buried and forgotten, their names lost in casualty figures too large for individual accounting. The faith, the hope, the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. Everything falls, and those of us who survive the falling are left to pick through the rubble, searching for something worth saving. I have been searching for 11 years. I have found very little, but I keep searching nonetheless. I keep watching. I keep bearing witness to the death of a hive, one level at a time, because someone has to remember. Someone has to know. Someone has to carry the weight of 14 million deaths and make sure they are not forgotten. Even if remembering is its own kind of collapse, its own slow falling that will eventually consume whatever remains of who I used to be. The Emperor protects, Father Mordecai used to say. I do not know if that is true, but I know that the hive does not protect. The hive falls. The hive is falling still, and I am falling with it, one floor at a time.